Number 10. Anthony Pettis is the former UFC lightweight champion. Since losing his title to Rafael dos Anjos at UFC 185, he hasn't looked like the same fighter he was before. In the octagon, we see a more hesitant Anthony Pettis who doesn't know when to pull the trigger. He last lost to Max Holloway by TKO in the 3rd round. At UFC 206, he is 1-4 in his last 5 fights, and I believe if he doesn't win his next couple of fights, the UFC will be forced to let him go. Number 9. Matt Brown is the number 14th ranked welterweight who didn't look good last year. Earlier in the year, he lost to Damian Maia by submission via rear naked choke in the 3rd round at UFC 198. He next lost to Jake Ellenberger by TKO in the 1st round at UFC 201 and recently was knocked out by Donald Cerrone in the 3rd round at UFC 206. He is currently on a 3-fight losing streak and needs to win his next fight to remain relevant in the division. I believe if he doesn't win his next couple of fights, the UFC will be forced to let him go. Number 8. Uriah Hall is the number 13th ranked middleweight in the UFC and has had a very unsuccessful 2016. He first lost to Derek Brunson by TKO in the 1st round at UFC Fight Night 94. He then made a quick turnaround and faced Gegard Mousasi in a rematch at UFC Fight Night 99, where in the fight he was finished by TKO again in the 1st round. He desperately needs a win if he wants to remain in the promotion. He is currently on a 3-fight losing streak and hasn't been scheduled to fight. Number 7. Travis Brown is the number 10th ranked heavyweight who hasn't looked great in his last few fights. He first lost to Cain Velasquez by TKO in the 1st round at UFC 200. He next filled in for injured Ben Rothwell and lost to Fabricio Verdum by a unanimous decision at UFC 203 and most recently lost to Derek Lewis by TKO in the 2nd round at UFC Fight Night 105. Since changing camps, his career has gone downhill rapidly. He urgently needs to win his next fight to remain in the UFC. Number 6. Ross Pearson is the Ultimate Fighter Season 9 winner. He had a very rough 2016 where he fought 5 times and won only one of those fights. He's one of the most entertaining fighters on the roster and always guarantees to put on a show whenever he fights. He last lost to Stevie Ray by a unanimous decision at UFC Fight Night 99. Even though he's an exciting fighter to watch, I believe the UFC will be forced to release him if he doesn't win his next fight. Number 5. Hector Lombard fights in the UFC middleweight division and hasn't looked great ever since he returned from his suspension. In early 2016, he lost to Neil Magny by TKO in the 2nd round. He was next knocked out by Dan Henderson in the 2nd round at UFC 199 and most recently lost to Johnny Hendricks by a unanimous decision at UFC Fight Night 105. Since USADA has been implemented, he doesn't look like the same fighter that he used to be. He is 1-3-1 in his last 5 fights and desperately needs to win a fight, otherwise the UFC will be forced to let him go. Number 4. CM Punk was set to make his professional mixed martial arts debut against Mickey Gall at UFC 203. CM Punk was a white belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and had trained for more than a year for his debut. On the other hand, Mickey Gall had defeated Mike Jackson at UFC Fight Night 82 and was a high-level brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. In the fight, Mickey Gall took CM Punk down and sunk in a rear naked choke in the 1st round, winning the fight. With CM Punk saying he wants to fight again, I believe the UFC will give him another chance, but if he loses again, the UFC will have no choice but to let him go. Number 3. Brandon Thatch fights in the UFC welterweight division and has high-level striking, but his recent performances inside the octagon haven't been impressive as of late. He made his debut defeating both Justin Edwards and Paulo Thiago impressively, but was next sidelined with injuries. When he returned, he lost all of his next 4 fights by submission. Even though he's an exciting fighter to watch, I believe the UFC will be forced to release him if he doesn't win his next fight. Number 2. Former UFC heavyweight champion Andrei Arlovski had the most unsuccessful year last year out of all the fighters on the roster. He was on a 6-fight winning streak and was on the verge of a title shot until he ran into Stipe Miocic at UFC 195, where he lost the fight by TKO in the 1st round. He next lost to Alistair Overeem by TKO in the 2nd round at UFC Fight Night 87 and then lost again to Josh Barnett by a rear naked choke in the 3rd round at UFC Fight Night 93. He most recently lost to Francis Ngannou by TKO in the 1st round at UFC on Fox 23. He's now on a 4-fight losing streak and is on the verge of getting cut from the UFC roster. I believe if he doesn't win his next fight, he may be released from the promotion. Number 1. When Jessica Ai made her UFC debut, she was being pushed as a potential prospect who would eventually challenge for the title, but that wasn't the case. She has struggled against top UFC bantamweights and hasn't been able to build up momentum in the promotion. She is currently on a 4-fight losing streak and hasn't looked impressive inside the octagon. Since joining the promotion in 2013, she has won 1 fight and lost 5 fights and has won no contest. I believe the UFC has given her too many chances and she will likely get cut from the roster if she loses her next fight.